Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. Today's author series is sponsored by the White Fund. We'd like to thank the White Fund trustees for their generosity in sponsoring today's event, featuring, of course, Lawrence native Joe Blanchet. We want to also note that our Irish Heritage Month events are partially funded by the Lawrence Cultural Council. We want to thank them also for their support. Our sincere thanks to Heritage State Park for hosting today's event, as well as our exhibit, the Reverend James Chiarelli, OSA, the Augustinians, and their contributions to Lawrence, which is in the gallery. Please take a look at it before you leave. And we want to also thank Lawrence Community Access Television for being with us today. We're hopeful that you will attend many of our upcoming events during Irish Heritage Month as we celebrate our great city and the contributions the Irish have made to the public. It's now my pleasure to introduce Jay Dowd of the White Fund, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Jay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our esteemed speaker this afternoon. Joe is a native of Lawrence. He currently lives just south of Burlington, Vermont. He is a graduate of St. Michael's College in that state. He and his wife, Peg, have two sons, Joshua and Jude, and their first grandchild, Hamish, arrived in 2020. Joe started his professional career as a history teacher, high school, I believe, then had a 2-decade run as a union advocate for all the teachers in Vermont. Today, Joe chairs the board of a Catholic long-term care facility in Vermont, and he is an active parishioner. I need to tell you that this introduction of Joe is long, long overdue. His visit was preempted by COVID twice. This lecture got its start actually in 2019 while I was doing some research to put missing names on a family grave at St. Mary's. The dates on our ancestral stone there indicated that my great-grandfather must have been a famine Irish refugee. We found his Lawrence address soon in an old directory at the library. He was living on the bank of Shanty Pond. Although I had heard of it, I knew little about this place. Louise Sandberg handed me a book. "Read this," she said. "It'll answer all your questions." It was The View from Shanty Pond by Joseph Blanchet. It did indeed answer all my questions, especially those spelled out in the chapters on Irish political ascendancy and, of course, politics and patronage. I felt like I was reading about all the people that I knew. Joe had an order form in the back of the book, so I called him. I wanted copies immediately for my daughter and son. They needed to know all about where they came from. The conversation moved quickly to our common experience of growing up in Lawrence and the people and places that we remembered fondly. He told me how he discovered the Irish side of the Blanchet family and the fascinating story of his great-grandfather, Peter Cassidy, the Bard of Lawrence. Joe brings Peter's songs and poems to us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Joe Blanchet.
Thank you. Yes, I'm a little grayer. I'm a couple of years older, a little thinner up top than I would have been 2 years ago had I been here. But we'll see what we can do. And I appreciate you coming out. I'm glad we ducked that storm. So let me turn on here. So here I am, a guy with a French name, about to give a talk in advance of St. Patrick's Day to a pile of Irish men and women. That doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? In the 50s and 60s, as Jay alluded to, I grew up here in South Lawrence. I went to St. Pat's Grammar School, then went to Austin Prep. which is another place this gentleman and I connected. We were riding the same bus and didn't know each other too well. I was a senior when he was a young pup, so we didn't talk to him back then. But we both went down to Austin Prep. But back in the 50s and 60s, at least in my household, ethnicity wasn't a real big deal. I can't ever recall my family, my dad or mom, talking about our ancestry. It rarely, if ever, came to mind. But looking back decades later, I understood why I had so many Irish friends and classmates. Kellys, Doyle, Mahoney, Fitzpatrick, Connolly, Curran, Kennedy, McGuire, O'Sullivan, Toy, Lanigan, on and on and on. I lived in a very Irish parish, and as you'll hear shortly, I realized subsequent I actually belonged there. My Irish inquiry actually began in 1981, shortly after one of my sons was born. I was researching my French genealogy. We'd come down to a cookout, and I had said to my dad, "How come you know so little about our French side?" And my father said, and I was startled by it, he said, "Well, that's because I was raised in an Irish house." I said, "What?" He said, "No, I grew up, my parents and I, we grew up with Peter Cassidy and his wife Maggie. And Peter," he said, "was called the Shanty Pond poet." But he didn't give me a whole lot more detail there. My dad and his family lived with Peter and his wife from 1922 to 1938. Peter, I subsequently found some photos of him. Peter's in the far right. He was one of the organizers of the Hibernian Rifles here in Lawrence back in 1986. Note those cute little curls in his forehead, okay? And then I found this picture of Peter around 1911. He's still got those two cute forehead curls there. He's about 50 years old here. And then I found this picture, which I put on my book because I really, very proud elderly Irishman with his two grandsons. My dad's with the glasses, and my Uncle Bud is on the other side of him. Now, my dad and uncle told me that Peter was well known to the patrons of the local taverns in Lawrence, especially South Lawrence. He played the concertina, that little squeeze box, okay? He loved nickel beers and Kelly kids, and he used to send my father and my uncle down to the store, neighborhood store, to buy cigars for him. Peter also bragged to his grandsons that he knew Buffalo Bill Cody. And they used to say that this is one of the reasons why Peter's wife, Maggie Devine Cassidy, used to call Peter Cuckoo. Now, what's interesting is when I was researching my book, lo and behold, I found out that Buffalo Bill was in Lawrence when Peter was here, okay? Just over in Glen Forest Park, just over the border. And knowing Peter as I know him, there's little doubt in my mind that he met Bill Cody at that time. Now, my dad had given me a small handful of yellowed poems about Peter that he took down from the attic, maybe about a dozen or so. Now, this was not the kind of poetry that I was taught at St. Patrick's, like Robert Frost, the title Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, or another Frost great, The Road Not Taken, or William Cullen Bryant's famous poem, To a Waterfowl. My great-grandfather's poems titles were like this: My daughter, she has me most crazy. We want that free lunch back again. Not a day in the house. And that poetic classic, The Shanty Pond Sewer. And instead of reading lines like Bryant's poems from, again, To a Waterfowl, wither midst falling dew, while glow the heavens with the last steps of day, I was reading lines from my great-grandfather's poetry like, I'm looking for the dish with the pickles and the fish, the platters with the crackers and the cheese, all kinds of meat you like from bologna down to tripe, with beans, hot clams, sauerkraut, and peas. I was especially puzzled when I was starting to read what I did have from Peter's work, and I'd read a phrase like, praise the lard, L-A-R-D. And I said, what's this all about? Until I finally realized that he was really, in his Irish accent, saying, praise the Lord. And so it came out, praise the Lord. Now, as a history teacher at the time, I was hooked on this. And I began researching my newfound Irish past. I began to study the history of the Irish people, their struggles in Ireland and America and in Lawrence. And my subsequent genealogy quest, including recent DNA, shocked me. I'm 76% Celtic blood, only 16% English and Welsh, and 8% French. Now, both Peter's parents came from County Galway, and the Cassidy clan comes from County Fermanagh in Northern Ireland. And I learned about the lofty stature of poets in Ireland dating back to the 3rd and 4th century, greatly respected and indeed feared, and holding a place in society back then on par with the tribal kings and chieftains. It was a serious crime to kill an Irish poet. And there's a legend, a story that goes that that's why a king that was fearing assassination used to have a poet sitting on either side of him. The poet's role continued and carried over in part into the 20th century as poets now in Lawrence helped, and other towns in the Northeast, preserved Irish history and culture and shared with the immigrant in the immigrant ghettos and urban centers. I started to now think much differently about my great-grandfather Peter Cassidy, the poet and songster, not so cuckoo after all. Now, my uncle, I then got very curious about this Shanty Pond. My Uncle Bud reassured me there was a pond here just about a block where we lived on Everett Street. But I was really quite skeptical given the look and the lay of the land. I don't know if you know down there, Sambon, Everett, etc. But then I started finding out, again, more history, that the dam construction in Lawrence, when the city was first founded, 900 plus feet across and about 35 feet high. So that's going to back up a lot of water, as I'm sure you know. And then and again, Irish essentially built this dam. Back then, there were about 2,100 Irish in the city, making up about 36% of the population. Then I found a couple of maps, and I draw your attention here. This is an 1845 map of Lawrence. And then following the building of the dam a decade later, lo and behold, there was Shanty Pond. The pond, it used to be a lowland wetland area with a stream that came all the way down from kind of Mount Vernon Street and zigzagged down through. But when you back all that water up, it really now was, and it was relatively deep. There was logging that went on this pond. A sawmill was there, skating, boating. There was a dock, and for a time, there was swimming. Now, along with the construction of the Great Dam, as many of you know, Lawrence exploded. By the mid-1850s, the B&M Railroad now came through the city and connected Lawrence with Lowell, Boston, Manchester, Haverhill. An estimated 450 or more buildings had been built. By 1855, there were 11 mills constructed, and an estimated 200,000 bricks a day were being delivered to Lawrence. Poor Irish immigrant laborers were doing most of the work for a daily wage somewhere between 75 cents and $1 a day. Some lived in boarding houses owned by the mill owners, and they paid about $2 a month, or they lived in tenement buildings. But many, the poorest, lived in tents, shelters, and shanties built in the Irish ghetto in the north part of Lawrence, referred to as the Plains. This is a well-known sketch or picture of the town that's about as good as I could get to give you an idea of this. It was made of scrapped and no doubt often stolen pieces of wood and metal and sod, with floors of packed sawdust, and they were scattered throughout the city for some time until the Essex Company began to relocate them, and they moved them over to the south side, immediately south of the dam. This area was called Dublin at first, then the city of Cork, the south side, the Andover side, and eventually it became called Shanty Pond. Now, we now are going to have both a body of water called Shanty Pond, and we are going to have an ethnic region, a ghetto, an Irish ghetto, if you will, an enclave called Shanty Pond. This is a list. I apologize for the out of focus, but these are 100 shanties owned by the Irish at about this time. And also to help orient you, I wanted to show you the Plains District, the Irish area enclave in North Lawrence, approximately. Eventually, the Irish spilled over into the above the Spigot River, and then down below we see the Shanty Pond District that we'll be talking so much about today. Now, during the last half of the 19th century, development continued at the north at a rapid pace, and it started to develop now in the southern area as well. I'm going to quickly take you through some maps so you can see this evolution, this development that played out on the south side. In 1854, some individuals who were working with the B&M Railroad took over property and built homes right across from where St. Patrick's Church and Rectory were built. Now, the church wasn't here then, but just to orient you, I kind of stuck it there for a moment, okay? By 1857, now we see it built heading west down what was called Dover Street back then. It's now Salem. And on the other side, Kingston Street down to about Newton Street. We go a little bit further. By 1865, they've gone all the way down, again, Dover, Kingston, to the edges of where the pond was. And notice on the, it's your left, the left-hand side, the Essex Company has now started to map out roads because they're starting to sell property there, in many instances to the Shanty owners, et cetera. And there's also a development taking place up in this region here, which is part of Shanty Pond, but it was kind of a subgrouping known as the Patch. It's an Irish group, but it was within the Shanty Pond area. And this is a list I typed up of that previous slide, and you can see virtually everyone, with one or two exceptions, is essentially Irish living in this area at this particular time. I swung the map around a little bit for you. All right, you see the pond, and now this area by the mid-1870s or beyond is all filled in. And again, once again, I got to get myself oriented. Yeah, here's the area known as the Patch, but the whole area here is known as Shanty Pond. And this is J. Dowd's it's just a straight grandfather's house, Edward Rice, right there, and he's right there. The property is about 43 feet wide and about 100 feet deep. This is the deed, 1865, Charles Storrow signed it. And again, we paid $265 for this. That's a lot of money back then. For some of us, that's a lot of money today. And these are the houses. I think that we agree it's probably the one on the left, as Jay and I keep going back and forth. That's Jay's great-grandfather's house. I've got to get him into the deed office to really nail this down. This is another very famous photo you've seen. What's kind of fun about this for me was until I did my book, nobody really was observant about what was in this picture, because there is the only known picture of Shanty Pond. All right? When I was talking to Ken Skulski was at the Irish immigrant city back then. He said, "You'll love this picture." He didn't realize it, but that shows us the pond. And right next to it, we see again Ed Rice's home. This is the map now, almost at the turn of the century. By now, what's happening is they're starting to fill in and drain Shanty Pond, the body of water, all right? And by the end of the decade, as you'll hear later on, it was completely empty. All the shanties, the remaining shanties were gone. And this is a picture that I doctored up to let you visualize a bit better where the actual pond area was. Obviously, it's not exact, but it's pretty darn close to give you a sense. You'll note here, this is the Weatherby School. Way up top is St. Pat's. And this, by the way, down here is where Peter Cassidy lived and where I was raised at 53 Everett Street. Okay. I got to find where I am. It was around the mid-1870s that Peter Cassidy moved to the Lawrence area, 75, 76. With his widowed mother. His dad died around 1871 from a fall. When I went and found the death certificate, they said that he was inebriated when he fell off of a, go figure. It's sad, but So Peter came with his mother, Mary Egan Cassidy, and brother Martin. They lived on 203 Oak Street, right behind old Lawrence High School, that particular area there. By 1981-82, all three of them were gone. Martin, his brother, winds up down in Providence, Rhode Island area. Peter moves out to the Midwest. I'll share a little bit about him momentarily. And I still have been unable to find Peter's mother, Mary, which is one of my next quests. This is a story I found online. I clipped in some material I got. It says that Peter's experiences have been known, and many known and varied. He has sailed on the Great Lakes, traveled with a night show called Scenery of Ireland throughout Canada, worked on the boats from Detroit to Cleveland in the rolling mills and shipyards in the lakefront. For 6 years, he worked in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, While working there, he was a loftsman in a bridge construction company. He was in an accident where his pal fell and was killed from the fall. Peter got but a dunking. These are all kind of experiences that kind of shaped Peter later on when he started writing his work, his poems, and his songs. In 1985, he marries this widow with 4 daughters. I'm convinced it was the friend who died. She was from Lawrence. Her name was Coughlin. And Thomas Coughlin worked with Peter in the mills. So I can't prove it yet, but otherwise it makes no sense to me. He suddenly shows up in Archbald, Pennsylvania, and marries this woman out of nowhere who's got 4 kids and another one on the way. What I'm going to do is, Peter moved back, in 1891, he moves back to Lawrence at 134 South Broadway with 6 daughters now. God love them. And over the next 20 years, he moves to 8 different locations all around South Broadway, which is kind of the eastern edge of Shanty Pond, until he finally settles down for an 11-year stint at 57 South Broadway. Now, what I want to do is take you a tour of the world that Peter would have seen at that edge of Shanty Pond. This is what it looks like today, and those of you who are familiar with South Broadway, this is kind of Shattuck and South Broadway. Bill, you've just been there, okay? I've always called this affectionately Cassidy Corners, because Peter lived at every single corner of this while he was bouncing around. He lived in the building that was over here, he lived here, and then wound up here, all right, among many other places. This is what Peter would have seen, all right, where we're walking there. As I said, he would have been over here. He lived in the 2nd floor apartment of this building. He lived in this building, and he finally settled in at 57 South Broadway on the 2nd floor, right there. Again, within a minute walking to St. Patrick's Church or thereabouts. So if you take that tour, we take a walk with Peter, if you will. I want to see one pleasant afternoon like this, what Peter would have seen and what those of you who are familiar with the area would see as well. This, by the way, is a shot of 59 at the floor and 57 right above where Peter's place was, okay? Conlin and Ryan Funeral Home, they later moved down right opposite St. Patrick's Church at a later point in time. And this is where the building used to be, all right, the Richdale place. Peter's building was on the left side of this parking lot. It's a wonderful picture. I have it framed in my house. It's so meaningful to me. No. So let's walk down the street and see what Peter would have seen. This was the fire station, barely a half a block from where he was, engine number 3, which was called Tiger 3 back then. Peter hung out here. He was a volunteer fireman, and they used to play cards, smoke cigars, and pool in the back room. This is the fire station today as we head south. Keep walking. This is the Daly block. There was a bar. John Daly had a grocery store at the basement there down the first level, and a bar, a saloon there that Peter no doubt frequently. Now what's interesting, in the next photo I want you to see, the lower 3 stories are there. They just lopped off the top story, okay? Everything is identical. I have no idea when that happened, but very, very interesting. We then go kitty corner across the street. This is at the corner of Salem and South Broadway. This is kind of the northeast corner. Where there was the city scales were there. This is where Peter would have seen and no doubt shopping. I took this picture 2 years ago. It's changed hands again. I drove by with my brother. I said, oh, darn it, I have an old photo. But 2 years ago, this was a legitimate shot, okay? And when I was growing up, and some of you were around, this was Victor Hugo's bicycle shop, okay? Good, there were a lot of heads nodding. You know, my memory's going, but it's not that bad, all right? And then directly across the street from St. Pat's, where again Peter used to no doubt shop for warm bread and rolls and whatnot, was Irish woman Mary Keegan's bakery. And if we look here today, it's the building, the white building to the left. How do you pronounce Lafay? Is that how you pronounce that? I'm not good at it, but that building there is where we'd be. Continuing down, some of you remember Patrick's drugstore. Don't know why we called it Patrick's, but there must have been some reason. And here, right near Dave Burke Way, is what's there now. Going a little further down, I know Bruckman's is still here. That's the building today. They got to be one of the oldest building or businesses left in the city at this point in time. Okay. Well, this is what they looked like. They were on the opposite side of the road, heading up towards South Broad. Do you remember this? He's nodding his head. I assume he was there. And this is what's there now. Right next to the Goodyear building is where the original Bruckmans would have been. This is 134. We're right behind the Goodyear sign. When Peter moved back to Lawrence, he would have been in that building, so that's still standing. And this is Everett Street, where he finally wound up going in 1925, where he stayed until the end of his life. Now, around 1991, I began to search for more of Peter's poems and songs. As I said, my dad gave me about a dozen of them, all right? And I just had this sense that there had to be, if this guy was called the Shanty Pond poet, there must be more there. And so I started doing a lot of research in the mid-'90s, and I might have gotten up to 20 or 24 or so of his poems. And then my brother Bill helped arrange a meeting in 1996 with a gentleman named Dude Regan. Any of you know Dude? An Irishman born in 1903, so he was well into his 90s when we sat down with him. And as I started mentioning some of the names that were in the poems that I had from Peter, Dude lit up and started telling stories, okay? And so what struck us was that I was on fertile ground here, that it made sense to keep digging because Peter knew, Dude said he knew Peter, certainly knew of him, and absolutely knew of Shanty Pond. So following that, I spent the next several years, Lord knows how many times I was in the library down here, weekends, traveled to Lowell, Salem, Boston, Rhode Island, Albany, Scranton, Pennsylvania, to the coal mine region where Peter was, and Washington, D.C., trying to find work of Peter with very, very little success. I was despondent. No, I don't get despondent. Then in 1998, the summer of 98, Kathy Neff Ragsdale was with the Tribune. Again, many of you know the name, all right? I was able to get connected with her, and she did a big Sunday edition story on Peter Cassidy, the Shanty Pond poet, and my quest for his poetry and his song. The day after it ran, she called me. I'm up in Vermont. She called me up and said, Joe, there's somebody you need to talk to. And I said, come on, what's it all about? And she said, there's a gentleman named Jim Johnstone, Jr. And I said, what's it all about? And she said, you just need to call him up. She gave me the number. I called Jim up, and this is how the story went. He said, Joe, your great-grandfather and my father were very best friends. They were in the Moose Club together for decades. My father was the inner guard. Peter was the outer guard for decades. And he said in late 1937, as your grandfather was fading, he gave my father a ledger that contained all of Peter Cassidy's songs and poems. Now, the hair is starting to stand up on the back of my head here, all right? And I said, yeah. And he said, then in 1956, just before my father died, he gave me that ledger and asked me to take care of it, which I did. So for the next 40 years, he said, to be honest with you, it was kind of stashed in a drawer. And then in 1990, he said, earlier this year, my wife, we had to put her in a nursing home. So we had to sell our house and downsize, and I'm throwing all kinds of stuff out. And he said, and as I was clearing out the drawer, I found the ledger that my father had given me almost 40 years earlier. And I was going to toss it out, but I sat on the couch and I started thumbing through it, and I found this on one of the last pages that was there. Jim, his father, I hope you will keep this for old time's sake. And so Jim Jr. said, I decided to keep it. And lo and behold, I read this article a few months later that you're looking for work by your great-grandfather. I said, well, would you mind if I photocopied it? And he said to me, I think my father would want you to have it. And he said, so when you get a chance to come down, I'll give it to you. And my retort was, well, would tomorrow afternoon be too soon? And he said no. He said, come on down. So my brother Bill, my dad, and I went over. And it was a very, very moving hour we spent with him to reminisce and talk about his father and Peter and whatnot. And lo and behold, as I opened it up, there's the list that Peter kept. Peter was very proud of his work, all right? And he had kept a list of Peter called them songs, not poems, because he used to sing them most often. He'd often match them with other songs, almost as parodies. So there would be all these songs. I'd hit the mother lode, and as I thumbed through, he'd have folded up pages of song. This is one called My Daughter, She Has Me Most Crazy. And I love this line at the top. He writes, "This is facts." So he's trying to tell us, it is a true story about some poor woman. His son. And then what he did is he used to paste a wallpaper on this page, and then he would, any of the stuff that had printed, he'd cut it out and paste it on top of the wallpaper, which I thought was really quite quaint of him. And the other thing he'd do is he would occasionally write editorial comment on certain poems that were there. And I love this one because he was very protective of his work. And he wrote a poem in the coal mines after the famous Sullivan-Kilrain fight. All right? And he says, "This song I composed in 1889 after the fight, and J.J. Sullivan had nothing to do with it." Now, J.J. Sullivan was the city marshal, I think, or assistant city marshal back then. And down below he says it again. He, meaning J.J. Sullivan, had nothing to do with any of the songs that my name is signed to. Every song that is in this book belongs to me, and nobody can dispute the same. So over the next 12 months, again, my research quadrupled in terms of the amount of time I was spending here in Lawrence and Salem and in Boston. And time and again, I found while doing my research, I was going blind reading microfilm, that Peter was accurately describing the world he experienced from about the 1890s into his death of what was taking place in Lawrence, not just in the Irish community, but Lawrence in general. It was indeed a window back in time of his world. Now, by the turn of the century, Peter is having his work published in a number of the papers in Lawrence, but most frequently it was in a paper known as the Sunday Leader or just the Leader. Val Sellers was the editor, and he took a liking to Peter, and very, very frequently Peter's work would be in there. Peter was kind of most prolific during the second and third decades, so the teens and into the 20s, when he was really pushing out a lot of his work. And that's where I was able to find it. So what I want to do is highlight a couple of these, some of my favorites, because and it's a range of kind of subject areas about Peter's work. And one of them was, we want that free lunch back again. During Peter's day, there were an estimated 300 saloons scattered around Lawrence, and Peter was no doubt a loyal and frequent patron of many, especially in South Lawrence. Like others, he'd enjoy his Kelly Kid cigar, a nickel beer, would play his concertina, and sing his song. He would make up music to these songs he was reading and sing them in these smoke-filled rooms. Now, the temperance movement began in Lawrence in the 1850s, and back and forth attitudes about liquor sales bounced all around for the next 60 years, but suddenly there was a jolt to people like Peter and others when the Liquor Commission banned having food service during lunch and dinner time in the bars. Okay, that was the free lunch, all right? There was a furor that developed subsequent to this. For many people at this time, the food they would get in the bar, along with beer, was probably the most amount of caloric intake they got at certain times. Peter jumped right on the bandwagon and wrote this song, or this poem, which was printed in the letter, and I'm going to share just a couple of stanzas for you. We want that free lunch back again. Tell me, lad, why aren't you glad? What is it makes you sad? Come tell me now what makes you feel so blue. I've always been your friend, stick to you I do intend. If there's anything wrong, tell me do. He said, just listen here, as he wiped away a tear. I'll tell you I have worry and have pain. The reason that I sigh and the tears come to my eye, I'm looking for that free lunch back again. With a glass of beer, it would oft good cheer and drive away the hungry, craving pain. That's the reason I do sigh and the tear comes to my eye. I'm looking for that free lunch back again. And then the chorus read like this. You've heard a little of it. I'm looking for the dish with the pickles and the fish, the platters with the crackers and the cheese, all kinds of meat you like from bologna down to tripe, with beans, hot clams, sauerkraut, and peas. That pickled cabbage red and a piece of baker's bread would drive away the hungry, craving pain. It's the reason that I sigh and the tears are in my eye. I'm looking for that free lunch back again. Peter wrote any number, probably more than anything else, was writing what I'm going to call tribute poems to politicians. Jay kind of hinted at this, okay? And again, what I'm going to share with you are some of my favorite people. All right. Oh, I'm sorry, I blew it here. This is a picture of the free lunch setup. And this is the commission backed off after 3 months, okay? And the pressure was pretty intense, all right? And what's interesting, though, is it wasn't but a few years after that the Volstead Act was passed in 1919, which started prohibition as of January of 2020. So they might have had their free lunch and their alcohol use for another 5 years, but then things, as you all know, clamped down completely for quite some time, and there was great disruption. Also, what used to happen is because they weren't going to the saloons during this time. This is from another one of Peter's little booklets, a calendar. Peter had his own pub in the house, or Irish kitchen, which was many people did. And I will admit, this is darn hard to read, but I tried to flag where it says whiskey, rum, and brandy, okay, were Peter's recipes. I had a friend who was supposedly studying this area because I wanted to help him see if we could make it, but he was a student. He said, I can't get you there yet. I said, all right, but I'd hope to get there sometime. Okay, we're moving on to these tribute poems. One of them was to a gentleman named Pat O'Connor. Pat arrived in Lawrence around 1891, which is about when Peter came back to the city. And at that time, he worked in the mills as a dryer, then a clerk, and then he opened a saloon at 106 Lawrence Street in 1907. He was a member of the Elks, a member of the Knights of Columbus, and he was a member of Division 8 of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. He married Nora Coakley, and this couple had 7 daughters, okay? Lived on Avon Street much of the time, did live in the Carltonville area of South Lawrence on Bigelow Street for 3 or 4 years. But once Prohibition went into effect on January 17th of 1920, the Volstead Act, he could not, like others, stay in business, and he lost his saloon. He went to work as a shoe dealer and then went into real estate. In 1925, he was concerned about corruption that was going on in the city due to moonshine and bootlegging business, and he decided to run for the director of public health, which oversaw the police department. Patsy was very unique in his campaign. His slogan, as you see there, he's a man of few words, but he means what he says. And night after night, in giving talks around the city, he would say, I am not going to tell you yet what I'm going to do if I get elected. I'd rather wait until I get into office and then show the voters of the city just what I mean by my slogan. He focused on honest enforcement of law and protection of home and family life. This fight, he used to say, is the fight of the mothers and fathers of Lawrence with the children at stake. And he said, I am the father of 7 daughters. Vote for me if you want to protect your sisters. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite you to come with me into John Daly's in Daly Block down before his saloon one Friday, Saturday, Tuesday, Monday night, smoke-filled night, where Peter was in there, and he would have been in singing his song, When Patsy's Alderman. And I'm going to sing a few stanzas for you to get a little bit of a feel of what this might have sounded like. Hang with me on it. They call him Pat O'Connor of the great O'Connor clan. He's now a politician, he's to run for alderman. Pat says if he's elected, the first thing he will do, he'll get rid of all the moonshiners and give us some good home brew. Now we all remember Patsy, for the Volstead Act did pass. When Pat he gave big schooners 16 ounces to the glass. 'Twas then the beer was good and clear, it cost a nickel then. But now the ounces are down to 6, and the price it's up to 10. Since its earliest days, the Irish in Lawrence have been extremely supportive of Ireland's effort to get out from under British rule, offering moral, political, and financial support for an independent state. This fervor picked up after the failure of the 1916 Easter Rising by the Irish Republican Brotherhood and the Dublin Volunteers. And one of the more powerful and militant wings of the entire movement in Ireland was known as Sinn Féin. At about this time, several Sinn Féin leaders self-declared the Irish Republic. It's like the Declaration of Independence. We just did it. Well, they did this over there, all right? They created a parliament and they formed this new republic. The head of Sinn Féin, Eamon de Valera, hoped to take advantage of the World War I treaty talks in Versailles to gain recognition for the self-proclaimed new Irish Republic. They got absolutely no support from the United States, from France, and not surprisingly from England at that time. De Valera realized he needed to get money because they weren't going to help him, so he started reaching out and appealing to Irish-loving people in the United States, in the Americas. And he found very fertile ground in Lawrence. By the spring of 1919, a local victory fund was set up, and it ran for a number of years after that. Peter wrote a number of poems at that time, or songs, excuse me, all right? He has Sinn Féin all over it, which he used to sell to raise money. And if I think I'm going to be honest, and if I think I know Peter, yes, some of it went to the Victory Fund, and I have little doubt that some of it went to the Peter Cassidy Fund. All right. The Ireland's Hero Fund references 3 IRA members who starved themselves to death in prison in 1922. And the other one in 1919, I think I've given you all a copy of that, is about Francis Leahy, who died an Irishman who died in 1918 over in France. He was a child of Shanty Pond. And indeed, he was of the Patch. He was on Tyler Street. So he became kind of an instant hero. His famous line, which Peter quotes in his song, was, "Lieutenant Hanson, the command is forward." And I can remember Dude Regan saying that when we started mentioning it. Dude said, "Yeah, the command is forward, Lieutenant Hanson." So it was fun to find a Peter's poem about it. So by June of 1919, the Irish in Lawrence had raised over $22,000 for this victory fund. I don't have to tell you, that's a lot of money back then, a tremendous amount of money. And 40% of it came from Ward 6, which encompassed not just Shanty Pond, but a lot of the area in South Lawrence. But de Valera realized that he had to make more of a personal connection. So he came over in June, 28th and 29th, he arrived in Boston to a hero's welcome. And there's a newspaper story that talks about de Valera's visit to Fenway Park. Here's a picture of the crowd that gathered that day. Here's from a newspaper story. De Valera, an Irish statesman, came to Boston and was given a reception of immense proportions. The affair had taken place in the baseball park, Fenway. Peter Cassidy had written a ballad in honor of the famous visitor and had copies made. He also had to compose the music to fit the words. During a lull in the program, Peter went out onto the field and sang his ballad. The spectators were delighted, and within a few minutes, Peter had sold practically every copy that he had. Peter repeated his performance when de Valera went to another Massachusetts city and gave his talk again. Once again, Peter's magic was effective, and more copies of his ballad were sold. So if you look at this picture, if you look very, very carefully, I think you'll agree, that's down where de Valera would have been, and you really have to look carefully. I swear that's Peter Cassidy up there. Not really. Just teasing. On June 30th, on his way back to Manchester, New Hampshire, de Valera stopped in Lawrence, an Irish fundraising headquarters at 408 Essex Street, where I checked this out, Zena's nails are today. That was it. I do try to bring the past to the future when I can, okay? He thanked 4 AOH divisions and the Ladies Auxiliary for their critical fundraising assistance, and he acknowledged that 2 weeks earlier, on June 16th, by a vote of the City Council, Lawrence was the first city in the United States to officially recognize the new Irish Republic. St. Patrick's Day. Aha, finally. Well, this week we're going to celebrate, and I have an entire talk I do just on St. Patrick's Day in Lawrence, but needless to say, we're not going to do that today. That said, Peter often wrote nostalgically about St. Patrick's Day and what he called the passing of St. Patrick's Day. In the 1850s, there started discrete, low-key celebrations of St. Patrick's Day in Lawrence. Holy Mass, an oyster supper, toasts, speeches, music, dance, and of course, some beverage. These were very hostile times toward the Irish, towards immigrants in general in the 1850s. The so-called Know-Nothing Party was in power in the mid-50s, extraordinarily hostile and violent at that time. By the early 1860s, many Irish in Lawrence went to Lowell for its parade. In 1864 marks the first formal St. Patrick's Day parade on record in Lawrence, sponsored by the Irish Benevolent Society. Following the Civil War, where the Irish really enhanced their reputation as true Americans in the United States, grand parades were held in 1866, 68, 70, 71. Indeed, in 71 was the first time the parade crossed over into South Lawrence, which tells us a little bit about, obviously, what had developed over there that they had to come over and visit. By 1875, smaller parades were held, or they were done more intermittently, because they were too costly. There was an economic downturn, and people were a little sensitive about spending a lot of money on parades while Irish were struggling over in the old country. There were no parades, so 1876 was the relatively large parade that also crossed into Shanty Pond, but there were no parades from 77 through to 87. There was another grand parade in 1887 and again in 97 to mark the anniversary of the 1967 Manchester martyr incident. John Breen, I got to tell you, these are two pictures of parades. I couldn't find any picture. I'm cheating. This is Haverhill. So pretend, okay? I'm not going to lie, all right? This is Haverhill. But it gives us a little look, okay, of what things might have been about. The dress was obviously going to be the same, okay, as they marched. And here's another one in more of a winter setting, colder at the time, marching in the city at that time. And then this is a picture of John Breen. I do not believe this is a Patrick's Day parade, all right? I think it's a little too warm looking, but I wanted you to see John Breen because he often was the Grand Master, the Grand Marshal, the Chief Marshal in the particular parade. In 1987, over 3,000 people participated. Indeed, it was the only parade held in the entire state of Massachusetts, was here in Lawrence. And there must have been a dozen and a half AOH divisions and bands from all over Massachusetts who came to join the parade. 1897, as I said, was a huge parade. And this one, along with the one in 67, are probably the only ones that Peter actually experienced personally. Because again, he had left her in the 80s, had gone to the mines, and he came back here. So in any event, Peter laments the old-time Patrick's Day, and I'm going to read a couple of stanzas of that because it gives you a flavor of it, and I think it would be appropriate because we're about to celebrate soon. Peter writes, "We don't see Patrick's Day parades as we did in days of old. We don't see Irish banners of green with Tara's harp of gold. No Irishmen are marching with green sash, white cockade. Will there ever again see an Irishman in a St. Patrick's Day parade? At early dawn, St. Patrick's morn, each little lad and lass sure felt proud being in the crowd as they went off to Mass. Everyone seen had a ribbon of green, a shamrock, or from the old sod. To begin the day, they were on their way to offer prayers to God. All cops there were Irishmen, and each was glad to leave his beat, to be in the advance and get a chance to lead the parade along the street. Suits cleaned and pressed, they looked their best, each one carried a stick. I now remind you that was a time when every cop was called a Mick. Crowds would part, the parade would start, cheers would rend the air. When the Honorable John Breen came along, Lawrence's first Irish mayor, with sword and sash and shiny tall hat on his breast a sprig of green, that Hibernian crowd sure felt proud of Grand Marshal John Breen. And he closes with, a Patrick's Day parade I'm much afraid we'll never see again. The times aren't like they used to be since the Irish left the plains. Now they've crossed across the Spigot or gone over to Back Bay. Those days are past. We've seen the last of Patrick's Day parades. Records indicate that Peter Cassidy is about 5 feet 5 inches tall. A bit rotund later in his life, although as a young man working in the mines, he obviously had to be in pretty decent shape at that time, and he loves sports. He enjoyed boxing and baseball, which frankly most everyone enjoyed back then. Those were the key sports of the common men and women. Lawrence had many baseball teams in many leagues: the school league, police league, social clubs, church, amateur, youth, semi-pro, pro leagues. Not to be confused with the major league teams, because they had both the Red Sox and the Boston Braves at that time as well. Irish dominated the sport at that time, and indeed one of Peter's daughters married a semi-pro baseball player, Larry Mahoney. Women playing baseball was not a novelty at this time, right? It started in Vassar College in the 1860s, and many colleges followed suit. By the 1920s, Lawrence had a number of all-girl, all-women teams who played against one another. Attendance was not as great at the men's team. Men's tended to think of it just as a bit of a novelty. All this changed in 1922 when a well-known female baseball player named Lizzie Murphy came to town to play baseball. Lizzie was in the vanguard of a select group of women who played on all men's baseball teams. She was born in Warren, Rhode Island in 1894 and was accomplished in many sports. Lizzie used to play pickup games with her brothers at about 15. She joined an all-men's team in Warren. By 24, she joined Ed Carr's Boston All-Stars, a semi-pro team that used to play exhibition games against American League and National League All-Stars. All right, so she really kind of stepped up. She was known as the Queen of Baseball. She was clearly quite feisty, thank God, because she was a little upset she wasn't getting paid what she thought she was worth because of what she contributed to the team. So she had baseball cards done up, and she used to sell them between innings for 10 cents, all right, to get her due. Now, in June 20th of 1922, Lizzie came to Lawrence with a semi-pro team called the Providence Independent, and they played a Knights of Columbus team at the time. And the newspaper story, this is just a section of it, don't try to read it. I'm going to touch this in another one, talked about the visit. And it's very interesting. Listen to the terminology they use. With the visitors team is Lizzie Murphy, a girl, who is reported to play the sack as well as any man. She has been making a big hit wherever she has performed. According to the newspaper account, this is all from my book, by the way, there were more than 9,000 fans and fanettes there to see the fun. The fans gave Lizzie a great hand when she first came to bat in the third inning. She can play ball in her own right, too. She hits the ball well and can field with the best of them. The box score listed her as Miss Murphy, and she got one hit that night as the Independents defeated the home team 3-2. Hats off, the Tribune reported to Miss Murphy. She was the object of, they said, 10,000 wondering fans last night. She fielded the initial sack as well as any first baseman. Disregarding the fact that she is a woman, it might be said that her performance was scintillating. But when you stop and think that she is a woman, then her play was nothing short of remarkable. The women folk attended the game in large numbers and had numerous chances to cheer on their idol. Everyone wanted to be like Lizzie. And in the weeks that followed, they say that young brothers could be heard calling out to their sisters playing baseball, yelling out, "Hey there, Lizzie." Now, she came back on July 9th, 1922. This time she played, they stepped up in terms of the quality of the team they played. They played one of Billy McDonough's Lawrence Independents, and she lost this time. Indeed, she had an error. All right, they lost 4-2, which is really one of the reasons Peter writes his song, because he's trying to convince Lizzie to come back to Lawrence and play baseball. This is the wrong one. So here's the song. We're in the bar again, smoke-filled, John Daly's bar. We're gonna sing a few stanzas for you here. Lizzie Murphy, please come back again. We want to see you play. 'Cause your team, it got defeated, Liz. Please don't stay away. The baseball fans are with you, Liz, the big ones and the small. For Lizzie, we're all dizzy since we saw you play baseball. There's no female girl like you, that we must admit, that can catch and throw a baseball and like you make a hit. Or take your place at first base, on them you have the call. For Lizzie, you're a wonder, the way you play baseball. He closes with, so come back to us, dear Lizzie, come back and play once more. We'd like to see you, Lizzie, before the season's o'er. So just pay us a visit list once more before the fall. For Lizzie, we're all dizzy to see you play baseball. And Lizzie did return. She did come back. Peter wrote another poem attesting to this. Now we come to another tribute poem. Politics didn't start getting tough, and it wasn't a cage match the past 10, 20 years or more. It's been tough, the history of the city, the history of the United States, really. All right? But it was rough and tumble in Peter's day as well. And in 1927, there was a battle between Pat McNulty, and by the way, Peter wrote a poem. He was a supporter of Pat McNulty at this time, by the way, and this guy from South Lawrence, John W. McCarthy. Well, Pat lost his seat to John W. John McCarthy took all 8 precincts in Ward 6, but 2 years later, things got real tough. It was typical hardball cycle played out once again with McCarthy, alleging poor service, favoritism, corruption, putting men on the payroll as the election approached. Why would he do that? Okay, which essentially all politicians did at that time. In fact, this is why Peter used to write these tribute poems, because it helped get him jobs and got his friends jobs at that time. Now, one ad from one of the opponents in that election was said Robert Hancock said, "It's a fact that you added 100 men to the street department on the Saturday before the Tuesday election." He said, "Now you'll have 400 men employed with nothing to do." He said, the rhetoric, "Are you going to discharge them all the following Tuesday?" Again, things got tough here. And this is a cartoon that was there attacking John W. McCarthy now in advance of this election. Because McCarthy, again, was firing people, including veterans who didn't support him. My grandfather lost a job once with a guy he was supporting, didn't win. And Peter read a number of poems in 1929 in support of John W. McCarthy. Keep McCarthy in, McCarthy's outing, and the big race. And this is one of the poems, I'm going to take you through it because it may be hard to read, but it's really typical of how these things went, and you'll hear clearly what the whole theme was. This was written in the 1929 one. The caucuses are over now. We know McCarthy won. So there was a caucus, and then it's like the primaries. Okay, we know McCarthy won. The people appreciate all the good work he has done. The fight, it isn't over yet. Soon the last clash will begin. So get out the votes election day. Let's keep McCarthy in. There never was an alderman that did such work before. He rounded so many corners with 60 streets or more. 4,000 jobs he gave out to a regiment of men. They all will vote on election day to keep McCarthy in. You could find McCarthy on the job. He was never known to shirk. Every man he'd meet with a smile who was seeking him for work. If he couldn't place you right away, he'd tell you, call again, and then you'd bet a job you'd get. So keep McCarthy in. Let them throw their slanders. Let them cast their mud and dirt. With the people of the present day, those tactics do not work. You cannot keep a good man down. That's why they'll stick by him. So cast your vote on election day and keep McCarthy in. And the chorus in between all these verses was, let the slogan be McCarthy, let it be very long and loud. Talk McCarthy to your neighbor, talk McCarthy to the crowd. Talk McCarthy on the street to everyone, to those you meet, the tall, the fat, the short, the slim. Then you'll have the votes on election day to keep McCarthy in. Now, what happened here was in advance of the election, he won that particular year. But heading into 1931, things got real rough for John W. McCarthy, all right? And attacks came about corruption now, that he was essentially shaking down workers to help pay for his election campaign in 31. It came very, very, very intense. Finally, John decided he wasn't going to run late in the year. He backed away. And it was just in time because he was indicted for these very charges, okay, of pressuring employees to give money to him for the election. And indeed, he went to trial and was convicted. He and a guy named Sullivan and Reinhardt. He spent a year in jail and was fined $500. and Peter shifted gears. He no longer McCarthy made a comeback later on, but Peter had bailed out, moved on to the next one, which is what he tended to do. Now, I'm going to talk, my final story about the poetry was about someone who was my favorite. While I enjoyed talking about the political shenanigans of seekers and controversies, I really enjoyed most talking about the common man and women, the secretaries, the cops, the nurses, the athletes, the mill workers, the saloon owners, and the like. And one of my very, very famous favorites was Smiling Phil Riley, a popular son of Shanty Pond. Phil was born in 1894, had 3 sisters, and they were all orphaned very shortly after birth, and they came over here in 1900 as orphans, and they got split up with different families in Lawrence. Phil quit school at the 7th grade, like most young men did back then, all right, and went to work. He was a peddler for a time, then worked with Conlin and Ryan Funeral Home, which is in Peter Cassidy's area. That's probably where Peter knew him. Then he worked as a laborer for the Property and Parks Department. And this was Peter's turf, as I said. Phil loved the game of baseball. He pitched for the South Lawrence Ramblers Athletic Club and became the manager player of a South Lawrence businessman named J.J. Hurley, who later became mayor. This is a picture of Phil in the back row without the hat, Smiling Phil Riley. So each spring, Phil and his teammates could be found playing ball. Their home team was behind the Weatherby School in South Lawrence, in the Shanty Pond area. And Phil was very, very well known and very, very well liked. A news story read the following about Smiling Phil. He would, quote, light up any room he walked into. If you want some experience, just walk down the street with Phil and you begin to realize that there is hardly a man, woman, or child that does not know him. And everywhere he is greeted with enthusiasm given to presidents. Now, when the United States entered the war in April of 17, Phil signed up, like many of his compadres, to be in the war. Kind of an interesting shot, but kind of cute, I think. And he was all in Battery C, where my grandfather was also in. Edgar Scoots Blanchet was in Battery C and knew Phil Riley. South Lawrence men went over to France, and they would write home regularly about their exploits, and they would tell stories about one another, and often talked about Phil Riley. So Phil was at the front, but he was a cook, all right? Although he used to brag, apparently, from the stories I read, that he played far more of a role in defeating the Germans than he was warranted, but they teased him a lot. And so this is another shot of Phil with a gentleman named Thomas Cloby Corcoran. Cloby was a famous boxer in Lawrence, okay? Very, very well known in the teens and the 20s. And so Peter wrote this entire poem for Phil Riley that I'm going to share the whole thing with you. Phil Riley, oh Phil Riley, come home for just a while. We miss that red hair of yours and likewise your Irish smile. Things don't look the same around here. We can't tell night from day. Everything looks gloomy, Phil, since you left South Broadway. There's something wrong with all the girls. They all seem so sad. Since the day you went away, they said it was too bad. Not a smile upon their faces, not a jolly word they say. They're thinking of you, Riley, since you left South Broadway. Everything's so quiet, Phil, around old Tiger 3. There's no such noise among the boys as what there used to be. The back room don't look so bright where pool you used to play. Oh, Riley, how we missed you since you left South Broadway. The summertime is coming, Phil. What will we do at all? We don't have no Irish manager when the Hurleys play baseball. There'll be no one to raise a row on the umpire lad to flay when he gives a bum decision against the boys from South Broadway. I hear you're a cook, Phil. You don't do much in the trench, but that you can parlez-vous in Irish and in French. They tell me you'll get married, Phil, to a French mademoiselle. Phil, if you do, I'm telling you, don't bring her to South Broadway. Give my regards to Johnson, Reagan, and the rest, and don't forget Cloby and Luck. I wish them all the best. And when you lads come home again, the one thing we all pray, that you'll bring old Kaiser Bill and show him South Broadway. So So Smiling Phil came back into Lawrence. I'm not going to read this, but again, there were numerous little stories about him coming back, along with others, in the newspapers. And he would be he'd again hold court, and people would gather around him as he would share his stories. He made it home from the war, but sadly, he suffered from permanent damage from gas attacks. And by May of 1920, he began to regularly visit local physicians. His condition worsened in the year that followed, and frightened by the progression of his disease, he unfortunately stopped seeing a doctor in 1924. By 1928, in January, it had become acute. He could no longer hold a job. His condition was severe: shortness of breath, incessant blood cough, no energy, and his weight dropped in 3 months from 145 to 125. He was too sick now and scared to resist any longer, so he checked in to the Veterans Hospital in Rutland, Massachusetts on February 10th of 28. Sadly, Phil was diagnosed with having massive infiltration of tuberculosis in both lungs and larynx. And according to his medical files, which I was able to get through a niece, his condition was listed simply as bad. This is a picture of Phil when he was there, still smiling. I want to share with you a little bit about what happened. Though his condition steadily deteriorated, Phil Riley kept his smile and spirit and was very, very popular, not only at South Broadway, but at the Veterans Home. Seeing the seriousness of the condition, he went back, but then he went AWOL in March of 29 and headed back to Shanty Pond for one more time. He soon returned to Rutland, and a week later, on April 24th, he died at the age of 34. A letter sent back to his sisters by hospital officials listed everything that he left behind: a silk scarf, a carry bag, a top coat, one suit, a cup, a union suit, 4 pair of socks, a belt, 4 dress shirts, and 1 necktie. That was it. Later that year, on November 11th, 1929, Phil Riley was honored by his friends and veterans of foreign war when a playground just west of the old Shanty Pond, right near the Alicon Pool, which some of us you remember, okay, was dedicated to him. On a Sunday, balmy Sunday afternoon, several hundred soldiers marched down to South Broadway, Salem Street, where they were joined by hundreds of relatives and friends, including Peter Cassidy and his family, to reminisce and pay tribute to Peter. And when my book came out in '99, we decided to recreate that. There weren't hundreds of us, okay? But with Mayor Dowling, we found an error on the plaque to Phil Riley. And she was gracious enough to agree to have it corrected. So we rededicated the plaque, and we had a little parade. That's Father Carlson, and rededicated it. That's Phil Riley's niece, who was very helpful to me in learning more about Phil at that time. And I was just thinking, all these kids, they're probably in their late 20s or 30s. Are any of you here today who were with me back then? No? Okay, just wondering. The end of Shanty Pond. Because of all the development that you saw, Shanty Pond really became very much a sewer pit. All right, everything was draining down into the pond. Remember I said people were swimming there for a time, but not terribly long. And eventually it was realized that we weren't going to be able to keep it up. So they began sewer construction in 95, 96, 97. And in 1899, where the final leg was developed. All the shanties were now gone by 1898. And Peter wrote a poem. I'm not going to read it, all right? This is the famous Shanty Pond sewer poem. And guess what it's about? It's about guys getting work to work on the sewer. Then the project was completed by really the end of 1899. And by the turn of the century, the pond was no more. And within the next decades that followed, the 3, 4, 5 decades later, but certainly by the 1840s, Shanty Pond, the region, started to lose its designation. The pond was gone, and this area really was not commonly referred to that. So it slowly lost its historic, cultural, neighborhood designation. Now, Peter's final days in the mid-30s, the Depression had a serious impact on him. He didn't have a lot of money, he and his wife. They lived with my grandfather and his wife and my dad and my uncle. The Depression closed in. He suffered a heart attack in the early to mid-1930s, and a local paper called out to him asking if he was okay. There was an incident that happened. He was crossing the bridge, and there was some construction going on, and he tore a shirt sleeve. And in 1935, indicative of how times were tough for people back then, he wrote to the Phoenix Bridge Company asking them if they'd buy him a new shirt. And here's an excerpt from it. Again, Peter wasn't big on periods and punctuation, so this is part of the letter. I hope you will not think it rude of me to ask for a shirt or the price of one. I would not stoop so low, but the God's honest truth is I can't afford to buy one. I was trying to sell it to a one-armed friend of mine. Peter kept his wit, even though, okay. But it was no go. He said he had the wrong arm gone, or I must have had the wrong sleeve torn. When I say I can't afford to buy a shirt, I want to explain I have not worked in over a year, and my wife is living with my daughter and her husband. He works 3 days a week on the ERA. I can't get a job. I think he's saying there because they say I only have a wife and no dependents. They won't give me work. Perhaps you might think how me and my wife gets along. Well, we get our room for free. We buy our own feed. My wife gets $5 a week of old age pension. We live the best we can. The shirt cost $1.35 when I bought it, but I see them in stores now for $1. I don't know how it ended out. I don't think he got it. So despite life's challenges, Peter remained true to his Irish roots and tradition. And this is the final story I'll share with you about him because, again, to the bitter end, this is 1937, St. Patrick's Day. A newspaper story recounted another incident of Peter. On March 20th, 1937, Peter brought a touch of Ireland and that well-known Cassidy wit into the courtroom. Peter F. Cassidy, Lawrence's Shanty Pond poet, is as Irish can be. At present, he is serving on the jury in the local courthouse. Wednesday, he brought a couple dozen shamrocks and distributed them to his fellow jurymen, court attaché, and the judge that was sitting there. As a result, there was hardly a pell in the courtroom that did not pay tribute to the Emerald Isle's famous saint. Peter celebrated just one more St. Patrick's Day, and on Thursday evening, May 12th, 1938, he died at his home on Everett Street at the age of 37. He was laid out, it was an Irish wake. He was laid out in the living room on the east side, on the window over there, looking at St. Patrick's Church as family, friends came for no doubt libation and telling stories about old Pete. In his obituary ran, Peter Cassidy, well-known and esteemed resident of the city for many years, died last night. He was a well-known parodist, having written many parodies and songs, and his work along that line made him known as the Shanty Pond poet. So with that, I will thank you for your attention, and hope you enjoyed yourself. And I have one more thing. I don't know, Jay, if you could come up. I have one more thing I would like to do after I take a sip of water. If you're interested, we've pre-signed a pile of books there if you're interested in the book. Don't leave now, because I have a little presentation. As you heard, Peter was very, very interested in preserving his work. He took great pride in it. And that's why he passed it on to Jim Johnstone Sr. Jim Johnstone Sr. hung on to that work until just before his death in '56. He passed it on to his son, who carried it for another 40 years. And thankfully, because of their contribution, I was able to get a hold of it. Well, I think that Peter would want me to pass it on again. I'm going to keep the ledger book for my sons and grandson, okay? But what I did was with my help of my lovely bride, Peg, we typed up all of Peter's songs and poems, and I wanted to, as a librarian, what do you?
Trustee.
Thank you. I wanted to give you a copy of these, okay?
Could Pat Brooks also a member of trustee?
Okay. We'll need a picture too. I don't know if I'm gonna. For posterity's sake. Are you any good?
There you go, Pat.
Can you help? Good to see you.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you. I like to thank you, Joe. Just a fabulous gift that we'll bring to the library archives tomorrow morning. One closing remark: as far as the history of the White Fund is concerned, I always like to end lectures with the beginning and to let our latest White Fund lecturer know that this series began with Ralph Waldo Emerson. And so, Joe, you are the latest in a very long line of very famous speakers, and I expect that 50 or 60 years from now, someone will be saying, hey, you know, Joe Blanchet was a White Fund speaker. So thank you, Joe. That was fabulous. Absolutely fabulous.
Just before we leave,
Oh, more.
we want to mention a couple events that are coming up. 2 weeks from today, we have a concert at the Lawrence Public Library. We invite you there. It's a tribute to Tom Garvey, a Lawrence legend here. So you're welcome to come to that. It's free. It's at 2 o'clock. And I'd like to call upon Mark LaPlante wants to say a few words. And there are refreshments over here. Please help yourself.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark LaPlante. I'm the City Council President, and it was earlier in COVID that Bill Blanchet said to me, he said, actually about 5 years ago, Bill Blanchet said, you're interested in the history of Lawrence. He goes, I want to give you a book about the Shanty Pond. You have to read this book. And I have I've got like books this deep that I need to get up to read. And I said, sure, Bill, I'd be happy to put that in the list of books that I really want to get to. Well, in the beginning of COVID back in 2020, I saw this book on my bookshelf and I says, I have to read this book. And I did read this book, and it gave me a greater passion about the history that I think we all have a connection with. And so I was really touched by Bill giving me the book, and then just reading about especially the politics of the city. Not that I'm looking to pat myself on the back, but I'm really involved and love the history of our city. And I have served on the city council longer than anybody else in the city's history. I've gone back as far as 1860. This is my 17th year. I'm not sure what that means really, but the history of our city council is important. And Jay Dowd, quite frankly, was one of the big reasons why I'm on the city council. And he helped kind of push me in that direction a little bit back in 1998. Don't do the math because it was a break in service. But one of the things that I found out from Jay is that now Jay went to Austin Prep. I went to Austin Prep. And in this weekend, I found out that Joe went to Austin Prep, and I was just so fascinated and delighted that there's another deeper connection here from our educational background. And so what I wanted to do is a couple things. One thing I wanted to do is I want to make a pitch, and I'm going to bring Joe up here in a second. I wanted to make a pitch for the Lawrence World War I project, and it really, really struck home during the presentation. I think we all see this at our seat, and in our seat, it talks about Captain Leahy, which the Leahy School, of course, is named after. Several years ago, I went ahead and I got involved with the help of Lawrence Cultural Council, Lawrence History Center, and others, and got together and did a little history of the Lawrence, called the Lawrence World War I Project. I have these, come see me afterwards. These are pamphlets of the 36 gentlemen, doesn't include Smiling Riley because he died later, but the 36 men who died in World War I, and there is a bridge or a school or a park or a street named after them, with the help of 36 different people. including Jay Dowd as one of the guest presenters, including people like Governor Baker, who did one of them, did a video montage of their stories, even including Dominique Williams of the Wilkins of the Atlantic Hawks fame, his connection to the city of Lawrence through, and I'm going to blank out on the guy's name who went to Lawrence High. Someone's going to shout his name. Steve Holman, exactly. So Steve Holman did one because his I think it was his great uncle died and has a park named after him. Long story short, there are 36 stories. There are signs throughout the city. Please pick them up. QR codes are on there. You can actually listen to the 3-minute speech or 3-minute little talk about each one of those veterans. I'm happy to give those things out. Now, could you come up for a second? I just want to. I don't hand these things out like candy, but I do have these little City of Lawrence pins. Jay's got one because of the tremendous work that he's done for our city, for our connections. And whenever I find someone of distinction, someone of note, I want to make sure that that's you. I want to make sure that these things come out because it is part of our city, it's part of our heritage, it's part of who we are, and I want to give our City of Lawrence pin to you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. You got it.
Good to meet you.
Thank you. Nice to meet
When
you.
did you get out?